I stood in the driveway outside our home, warm fluid running down my legs as my water broke beside our family SUV. One contraction slammed into me so hard that I had to grip the side of the vehicle just to keep from collapsing. "Ethan, please," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Please, take me to the hospital." For one brief second, I thought my husband would rush to help me. Instead, he reached into the garage, grabbed an old towel, and started wiping the leather passenger seat. "I don't want you soaking the interior," he said, without even looking at me. Then he glanced at his phone. "My parents are already at the airport. The tickets are non-refundable. Call an Uber." A moment later, he stepped between me and the passenger door so I couldn't get into the SUV and drove away. "My name is Maya Wallace. I'm 30 years old, and less than 24 hours before I was supposed to become a mother for the first time, my husband chose a golf vacation with his parents over taking his wife in labor to the hospital. I wish I could tell you that was the moment our marriage ended. The truth is, it had been falling apart for much longer. But that morning was the first time he stopped pretending to care. What Ethan didn't realize was that someone else had witnessed everything that happened in our driveway. And over the next 24 hours, every lie he told, every excuse he made, and every desperate attempt to protect his reputation would only make the truth impossible to escape. Before I tell you how a simple security camera destroyed the image of the perfect family man he had spent years building, tell me where you're watching from today. And have you ever seen someone reveal their true character at the exact moment you needed them most? Because by the time Ethan finally realized what he had done, it was already far too late. If you had met Ethan Vance a year earlier, you probably would have thought I was the luckiest woman in South Carolina. He knew exactly how to perform the role of the devoted husband. Whenever we attended neighborhood cookouts or company events in Greenville, one hand always rested gently on the small of my back. He smiled for every photograph, joked about learning to change diapers, and proudly told anyone who would listen that becoming a father was the greatest adventure of his life. His social media pages looked even better. Photos of our freshly painted nursery, a tiny crib waiting by the window, captions about gratitude, family, and new beginnings. People left comments saying our son would be lucky to have a father like Ethan. Every time I read them, I wondered if they were talking about the same man who lived inside our house. Because once the front door closed, the performance ended. By the time I reached 39 weeks of pregnancy, simply getting out of bed felt like climbing a hill with weights tied around my ankles. My back ached almost constantly, my feet were swollen every evening, and sleep came in short, uncomfortable stretches between trips to the bathroom and practice contractions. Still, every morning, I got up before Ethan. I folded tiny baby clothes fresh from the dryer. I washed bottles we wouldn't need for another few days. I compared pediatricians, called the insurance company, finished hospital paperwork, paid the utility bills, stocked the freezer with homemade meals, and checked our hospital bag one last time to make sure nothing had been forgotten. I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was simply trying to make sure our son arrived in a home that was ready to welcome him. Ethan rarely noticed any of it. Most evenings, I heard his keys before I heard his voice. He would drop his laptop bag beside the couch, loosen his tie, and ask the same question. "What's for dinner?" Not once did he begin with, "How are you feeling?" If I mentioned my back hurting, he reminded me everyone was tired. If I said the baby had been kicking all afternoon, he barely looked up from his phone before saying that sounded normal. If I asked him to carry the laundry basket upstairs because bending over had become difficult, he sighed as though I were interrupting something important. At first, I kept making excuses for him. He worked long hours as a regional sales manager for Northline Outdoor Solutions. Maybe he was under pressure. Maybe becoming a father scared him more than he admitted. But excuses become harder to believe when disappointment becomes routine. Weekends belonged to his parents. Almost every Saturday, Ethan drove to their house an hour away. His father wanted golf or football. His mother always had his favorite meal waiting before he even arrived. It took me a long time to realize he wasn't visiting them as an independent adult. He was returning to the only place where nobody ever expected anything from him. Denise, my mother-in-law, had an opinion about nearly everything I did. According to her, women today rested too much, complained too much, expected too much appreciation for pregnancy. Whenever I mentioned being exhausted, she smiled politely and reminded me that women in her generation had carried babies without asking the world to slow down. Gerald usually nodded in agreement. "Ethan works hard," he'd say. "The poor guy deserves some peace before the baby's here." I often wondered when someone planned to ask whether I deserved a little peace too. The Friday before my due date, Ethan came home irritated because I had forgotten to buy smoked almonds, craft beer, and protein bars for the golf trip he planned to take with his parents. I apologized and offered to order everything for delivery. He shook his head. "They need it tomorrow." When I suggested he stop by the store himself after work, he looked at me as though I had suggested something completely unreasonable. "You've been home all day." Those 5 words hurt more than I expected. Home all day meant swollen ankles, doctor's appointments, insurance calls, cleaning, cooking, laundry, preparing for a newborn, trying not to panic every time another contraction tightened across my stomach. But I didn't argue. I picked up my purse, climbed into the car, and drove to Target. By the time I reached the checkout line, standing still had become more painful than walking. I bought every item Ethan wanted. Then I noticed a golf glove he'd mentioned weeks earlier. Without thinking, I added it to the cart. Some foolish part of me still believed kindness might eventually be returned. Outside, I struggled to lift the heavy case of beer into the trunk. Before I could try again, a familiar voice called my name. "Maya?" It was my neighbor, Mira Caldwell. She hurried over without waiting to be asked and lifted the box as though it weighed nothing. "You shouldn't be carrying this by yourself," she said gently. I smiled and gave the answer I had been giving everyone for months. "Ethan's busy." Mira didn't argue. She simply looked at my stomach, then at the overflowing shopping cart, before helping me load everything into the car. As she closed the trunk, she smiled kindly. "Busy men can still be decent men." The sentence was quiet. There wasn't a trace of judgment in her voice. Yet somehow, it echoed in my mind all the way home. Before we said goodbye, Mira pointed toward the small security camera newly installed above her garage. "Russell finally convinced me to upgrade the system," she laughed. "That thing probably sees more of this neighborhood than I do." She mentioned her husband had been traveling constantly because one of his company's biggest corporate partners was expanding across the Southeast. At the time, it sounded like ordinary neighborhood conversation. I had no idea those 2 small details, a security camera and Russell's business connections, would soon become part of the reason my life didn't stay buried under Ethan's lies. As I carried the groceries inside one careful bag at a time, I still believed I was saving my marriage through patience. I didn't yet understand that sometimes the people trying hardest to hold a family together are the only ones actually carrying it. Looking back now, I realized the golf trip wasn't the real problem. It was simply the first time Ethan stopped pretending that my needs mattered as much as his own. The evening before he was supposed to leave, he walked through the front door wearing the satisfied smile he always had whenever he'd already made a decision without including me. I was sitting on the couch with a heating pad pressed against my lower back, finishing the last of the thank you cards from our baby shower. For one hopeful moment, I thought he'd finally arranged his paternity leave or confirmed the pediatrician appointment I'd reminded him about 3 times. Instead, he tossed his car keys onto the counter. "Mom upgraded the trip." I looked up. "What trip?" "The Scottsdale one." He sounded excited. "She found a better package at a golf resort. Dad already booked the tee times." I waited for the punchline. It never came. "Ethan." I laughed nervously. "My due date is tomorrow," he shrugged. "Due dates are estimates. Our son could come at any time. First babies are usually late." His confidence wasn't reassuring. It was dismissive. I stared at him, hoping he would suddenly realize how unbelievable this conversation had become. "You can't seriously be planning to leave now." He sighed dramatically. "Maya, it's only 3 days. 3 days is a long time when your wife is 39 weeks pregnant." He rolled his eyes. "You're acting like I'm disappearing for 6 months." "No," I answered quietly. "I'm acting like I'm asking my husband to be present when his child is born." Instead of answering me, he unlocked his phone. A moment later, it rang. His mother's face filled the screen. Without asking, he pressed the speaker button. "There she is," Denise said cheerfully. "Has our nervous little mommy calmed down yet?" Before I could answer, Gerald's voice floated through from somewhere behind her. Tell Ethan not to let anyone ruin this trip. Denise laughed. Maya, once the baby gets here, Ethan won't have a moment to himself. Let the poor man enjoy one last vacation. I took a slow breath. I'm not asking for a vacation. I'm asking for my husband to stay close to home until our son is safely born. Oh, sweetheart, Denise replied, her voice coated with false sympathy. Women have babies every single day. I flew while I was pregnant with Ethan. 30 years ago, I answered, before I could stop myself. My doctor told me not to travel. She ignored that completely. You young women read too much online. Gerald chuckled. Ethan works hard. He deserves a break before diapers and midnight feedings take over. I finally looked directly at my husband. If you leave tomorrow, I won't forget it. The room became quiet. Denise frowned. Is that supposed to be a threat? I slowly shook my head. No, it's a boundary. Ethan's expression hardened. I can't spend the rest of my life managing your anxiety. My anxiety, I repeated softly. I'm carrying your son. I'm asking you to stay less than 24 more hours. You have neighbors, you have Uber, you have a hospital 15 minutes away. His words landed with frightening certainty. Somewhere inside him, he had already decided that I was the unreasonable one. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but something between us had changed. He answered my questions with one-word responses, complained that my hospital bag was taking up space by the front door, and spent the rest of the evening watching golf videos while I finished packing everything we would need for the delivery. The next morning, I walked outside and discovered the infant car seat hanging loosely from the back seat. He had installed it, poorly. One sharp turn, and it could have shifted dangerously. Without saying a word, I knelt beside the SUV and began reinstalling it myself. My stomach pressed painfully against my thighs every time I leaned forward. Sweat rolled down my neck despite the cool morning air. Inside the house, I could hear the television. Golf highlights. Ethan never came outside. After nearly 20 minutes, the final safety latch clicked into place. I leaned back against the driveway, exhausted. That doesn't look comfortable. I looked up. Mira was walking across the lawn carrying a covered bowl. I made too much chicken noodle soup, she said. Thought you might want some. When she saw the hospital bag beside the front door and the way I kept rubbing my lower back, her smile faded. Do you have someone ready to drive you if labor starts? The answer should have been simple. Instead, I couldn't bring myself to say my husband's name. Mira noticed the silence immediately. She set the bowl down, reached for my hand, and squeezed it gently. Listen to me, day or night. If you need to get to the hospital, call me. No explanations, no hesitation. I'll come. The kindness in those few sentences nearly broke me, because a woman who wasn't related to me, who owed me absolutely nothing, had just offered more security than the man who had promised to spend his life protecting me. As I watched Mira walk back toward her house, I found myself looking at the small security camera above her garage again. At the time, I thought it was simply another ordinary morning in our quiet neighborhood. I had no idea that within 24 hours, that little camera would capture the moment Ethan destroyed his own future. I barely slept that night. Every time I managed to close my eyes, another wave of pressure rolled across my stomach before fading again. They weren't regular enough to rush to the hospital, but they were strong enough to remind me that our son could decide to arrive at any moment. Beside me, Ethan slept peacefully. No questions, no concern, no curiosity about whether I was frightened. Around 6 the next morning, I woke to the sound of suitcase wheels scraping across the hardwood floor. For a few seconds, I lay perfectly still, hoping I had imagined it. Then I heard the zipper, the golf clubs, the front door opening. He was really leaving. I slowly walked into the hallway, one hand supporting my back. Ethan was standing by the entrance, adjusting the strap of his carry-on while his phone buzzed every few seconds. Mom says they're already at the airport, he muttered without looking up. A second message arrived. Dad wants to make sure we leave in the next 5 minutes. I stared at the packed suitcase, then at my hospital bag sitting only a few feet away. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One bag prepared for the birth of our son, the other prepared for a golf vacation. Ethan, he finally looked at me. I don't feel right. He sighed before I could say anything else. You're just nervous because you've been obsessing over this trip. My due date is tomorrow. I know. Then stay. The words came out softer than I expected. I'm not asking you to cancel forever. I'm asking you to stay until our baby is safely here. He rubbed his forehead impatiently. Maya, I can't organize my entire life around your anxiety. I looked at him for several long seconds. My anxiety or your responsibility? He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his suitcase and walked toward the garage. Some part of me still believed he would stop. That once he saw me following him, moving slowly, exhausted, heavily pregnant, he would remember that I wasn't asking for a favor. I was asking him to be a husband. Outside, the morning air felt strangely cool against my skin. Ethan lifted his luggage into the back of the SUV before checking his watch again. I took another step toward him. Please? He closed the trunk. Another dull cramp tightened across my stomach. Then, without warning, warmth rushed down both of my legs. At first, I froze. Then I looked down. Clear fluid spread across my leggings before dripping onto the driveway. My heart began pounding. Ethan, I whispered. My water broke. His head snapped toward me for one brief, beautiful second. I saw panic flash across his face. I thought he was finally going to help. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the passenger seat. Without saying a word, he walked into the garage, grabbed an old towel, and began wiping the leather interior. I stared at him in disbelief. What are you doing? I just had this detailed. Another contraction hit, harder than the last. I doubled over, gripping the edge of the open garage door. Ethan, I need the hospital. He glanced at his buzzing phone. My parents are waiting. They've already checked in. I can't miss this flight. I couldn't believe we were having this conversation. Our son is coming. I know. Then drive me. It's 20 minutes. You'll be fine, my voice cracked. I'm in labor. He rubbed both hands across his face like I was creating an inconvenience instead of a medical emergency. Maya, call an Uber. The tickets are non-refundable. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like something a stranger would say. Not the man who had once promised to love me for the rest of our lives. Another contraction forced me to grab the passenger door handle. Before I could pull it open, Ethan stepped directly between me and the SUV. Don't. I looked up at him. I just need to sit down. Not like that. He glanced at my soaked clothes. You'll ruin the seat. For a moment, everything became strangely quiet. The pain, the fear, even the tears. It was as if my heart finally accepted something my mind had been refusing to believe for months. This wasn't a selfish decision made in panic. This was who Ethan really was. I slowly released the door handle. He climbed into the driver's seat without another word. The engine started. He lowered the window only long enough to say, "Text me after you get checked in. And please, don't make this into a bigger deal than it is." Then the SUV rolled backward, turned onto the street, and disappeared. I remained standing in the driveway, one hand wrapped around my stomach, while another contraction nearly brought me to my knees. The neighborhood was quiet. Birds chirped. A delivery truck rolled past the end of the street. Somehow the whole world kept moving, while mine had completely fallen apart. Then I heard another sound, a front door opening. Maya, it was Mira. She ran toward me without hesitation. I saw everything. She slipped one arm around my shoulders before I could answer. Don't worry, I'm getting you and that baby to the hospital. At that moment, neither of us realized something else had witnessed the entire scene. Mounted silently above her garage, the small security camera continued recording every second. And somewhere inside that tiny memory card, the evidence that would eventually destroy Ethan's carefully crafted image had just been saved forever. Mira drove with the kind of calm that kept me from falling apart. She didn't waste precious seconds asking unnecessary questions or telling me everything would be okay. She simply called the labor and delivery unit at St. Agnes Medical Center, explained that my water had broken, and reminded me to focus on my breathing between contractions. In through your nose, she said gently. Out through your mouth. You and your little boy are my only priorities right now. I clung to those words the entire drive. Later, I would learn that Mira had worked as a labor and delivery nurse years earlier before changing careers. At that moment, I only knew that a woman who barely knew me was showing more compassion than my own husband. By the time we reached the hospital entrance, a wheelchair was already waiting. 2 nurses hurried outside. One helped me into the chair while the other asked, Is your support person parking the car? For a split second, I almost answered automatically. My husband, and the word caught in my throat. Instead, I looked back at Mira. My support person is right here. The nurse followed my eyes, smiled warmly at Mira, and nodded. Good. Inside the maternity ward, everything moved quickly. Hospital bracelets, consent forms, blood pressure, monitors. Another contraction crashed through my body before I could finish answering the admission questions. One of the nurses savage squeezed my hand. We're going to take good care of you. As she reviewed my chart, she quietly asked, Is there anyone you don't want allowed into the delivery room? The answer came surprisingly easily. My husband, I paused, and his parents. She didn't ask why. She simply marked my chart. We'll make sure your wishes are respected. For the first time that entire morning, I felt protected. While doctors prepared my room, Mira helped me call my parents. My mother answered on the second ring. She sounded cheerful. Good morning, sweetheart. The moment she heard me crying, her voice changed completely. Maya, what's wrong? My water broke. There was a brief silence. Then I whispered the part that hurt the most. Ethan left. My mother didn't speak. I could hear her breathing. A second later, my father took the phone. We're booking the first flight. You don't worry about us. You focus on bringing our grandson safely into this world. We're coming. Those two words steadied me more than any medication could have. The next several hours blurred together. Contractions became stronger, closer together. The pain demanded every ounce of my attention. Somewhere in between them, my phone continued vibrating across the bedside table. Boarding now. Everything okay? Any update? Then, why won't you answer? A few minutes later, Mom says you're ignoring us. Another contraction, another message. Please don't make this into drama. I never replied. My energy belonged to my son now. Several hours later, my parents rushed into the hospital room, looking exhausted from travel and terrified of what they might find. My mother hugged me carefully, trying not to interfere with the monitors. My father kissed my forehead. Neither of them asked where Ethan was. They already knew. Mira quietly stepped toward the door. I reached for her hand. Please stay, she smiled. I'd be honored. Late that afternoon, after hours of labor, one final push filled the room with a sound more beautiful than anything I had ever heard. A baby's cry, strong, loud, perfect. The nurse gently placed my son against my chest. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around mine. Every fear, every betrayal, every lonely mile between our driveway and this hospital seemed to disappear for one sacred moment. Hi, sweetheart, I whispered through tears. I'm your mom. You are so loved. My mother stood beside the bed crying openly. My father quietly turned away to wipe his eyes. The nurse asked whether we had chosen a name. I looked down at my son. Throughout my pregnancy, Ethan had insisted our baby should carry on the Vance family tradition. But as I held my little boy, I realized something. A family wasn't defined by the last name printed on a birth certificate. A family was defined by the people who showed up when love demanded sacrifice. Leo, I said softly. His name is Leo. Then, almost without thinking, I whispered the name that felt true inside my heart. Leo Wallace. My mother covered her mouth. She understood immediately. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was the moment I finally stopped pretending our marriage could still be saved. Several hours later, after I had been moved into recovery, my phone began ringing again. Ethan, I let it ring, then again, and again. Finally, on the fourth call, I answered. His voice exploded through the speaker. Maya, what is happening? Why is my phone blowing up? My manager keeps calling. My mom's crying. What did you do? I closed my eyes, waiting, just waiting for one simple question. How are you? Is our son okay? Did everything go safely? Instead, he kept talking. My company's acting weird. People are sending me messages. There are comments all over my social media. Maya, answer me. I looked over at Leo sleeping peacefully in the clear hospital bassinet beside my bed. Then I answered with complete calm. That's the price you pay. Before he could respond, I ended the call. The room fell completely silent. My mother looked at me with quiet pride. My father nodded once. Mira smiled sadly. She knew what all of us understood in that moment. I hadn't hung up because I hated Ethan. I hung up because I finally accepted that the man who abandoned his wife in labor had also abandoned his right to be the person I turned to when our son entered the world. Outside my hospital room, Ethan was desperately trying to understand why his perfect vacation had suddenly become a nightmare. Inside that room, I was beginning a completely different life. The next morning, I woke to the soft sound of Leo stirring beside my hospital bed. For a few peaceful seconds, nothing else existed. Not the driveway, not the airport, not Ethan, only my son. I reached into the bassinet, lifted him carefully into my arms, and watched his tiny fingers wrap around mine. No matter what happened after this, he would never doubt that someone chose him first. A gentle knock interrupted the moment. One of the maternity nurses stepped inside. "Mrs. Wallace?" She hesitated. "There's a situation downstairs." I looked up. "Ethan?" She nodded. "He arrived about 20 minutes ago, and his parents came with him." I closed my eyes for a moment. Of course they had. "What do they want?" "He says he wants to see his son, and your mother-in-law insists there's been a misunderstanding." The nurse glanced toward the chart clipped outside my room. "We haven't allowed them upstairs. Your instructions are very clear." Relief washed over me. "Thank you," she smiled. "You don't have to thank us. It's our job to protect our patients." After she left, my mother quietly adjusted Leo's blanket. "You don't have to see him." "I know, and I won't." About an hour later, another nurse returned carrying my phone. "You've received quite a few messages." I looked at the screen. 34 missed calls, 11 voicemails, dozens of text messages. The first few came from Ethan. "Please answer. Let's talk. You're overreacting." The next one sounded different. "Why is my boss calling me? Mom's upset." Someone posted a video. Then, "This is getting out of hand. You need to fix this." I frowned. Fix what? I hadn't spoken to anyone except my parents, Mira, and the medical staff. Before I could think about it any longer, Mira knocked gently on the door. She looked almost embarrassed. I should probably explain. She sat beside the bed. After I got home yesterday, Russell asked why I looked so shaken. I told him what happened. She paused. I also showed him the footage from our security camera. I blinked. "The camera recorded everything?" She nodded slowly. "The entire argument. Your water breaking. Ethan wiping the passenger seat. Him telling you to call an Uber, and him driving away." A chill ran through me. I never meant for anyone else to see it. "I know." Mira reached across the bed and gently touched my arm. "Russell didn't post it. He simply asked whether you were safe. And because Ethan works with one of Russell's biggest business partners, he believed the company deserved to know how one of its senior managers had behaved." I remembered Russell mentioning corporate meetings and regional partnerships months earlier. Back then, it had sounded completely unrelated to my life. Now it suddenly mattered. "A few people inside the company saw the video," Mira continued. "Someone recognized Ethan. Someone else recognized the SUV. After that, people started talking." She looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry if this became bigger than you wanted." I slowly shook my head. "You didn't betray me. Ethan did." Just then, my phone rang again. "Ethan." Against my better judgment, I answered. "Maya," his voice was frantic. "What the hell is happening? My director just suspended me. HR canceled my meetings. Dad says people are calling the house." I listened quietly. He kept talking. "My promotion's probably gone. Our biggest client is asking questions. Mom won't stop crying." Not once did he ask how Leo was doing. Finally, I interrupted him. "Have you asked about your son yet?" Silence. Only 2 seconds, but long enough. "Maya, I'm dealing with a crisis right now." I looked over at Leo sleeping peacefully, then back toward the window. "No," I answered softly. "You created the crisis. You abandoned your wife while she was in labor. You chose a vacation over your family." His breathing became heavier. "It wasn't like that. I was coming back. It was only 3 days. You had neighbors, you had Uber." Hearing him repeat those words, the very same words he had used in our driveway, removed the last trace of doubt I still carried. "You still don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He raised his voice. "If you don't tell people the video's misleading, I'm going to lose everything." There it was. Not "I miss you," not "I'm sorry," not "Can I see my son?" Only "I'm going to lose everything." I closed my eyes. "Ethan, the only person who destroyed your reputation, was the man who drove away. Then I ended the call. For several seconds, no one in the room spoke. Finally, my father broke the silence. He still thinks this is about public opinion, I nodded, because he's never understood that this was always about character. That afternoon, Brenda Lawson arrived. She introduced herself with a firm handshake, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent years dealing with people exactly like Ethan. I've reviewed the messages you've received so far, she opened the folder. I'd like copies of every text, voicemail, email, and call log. No deleting, no responding emotionally. From this moment forward, every word he sends may become evidence. For the first time since Ethan drove away, I didn't feel powerless. I wasn't chasing revenge. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was simply allowing the truth to remain exactly as it happened. And the more Ethan tried to explain himself, the deeper he buried himself with his own words. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later, I no longer felt like the same woman who had stood crying in that driveway. I wasn't stronger because the pain had disappeared. I was stronger because I had finally stopped confusing hope with denial. My parents loaded Leo's car seat into my father's SUV, while my mother double-checked every blanket and bottle as though she could protect us from the entire world through careful preparation. Brenda had already advised us not to return to the house I shared with Ethan. Not yet, she said. Let's make decisions with clear heads, not wounded hearts. Instead, my parents had rented a furnished townhouse nearby where Leo and I could stay until the legal situation became clearer. As we prepared to leave, one of the nurses approached quietly. I thought you should know. She hesitated before continuing. They're outside again. Ethan? She nodded. And his parents. I looked down at Leo sleeping peacefully against my chest. For a moment, I considered slipping out a different entrance. Then I realized something. I had spent too much of my marriage avoiding conflict to keep other people comfortable. I wasn't going to start doing it again. When the hospital doors opened, Ethan spotted us immediately. His clothes were wrinkled. Dark circles framed his eyes. The confident man who had driven away 3 days earlier looked as though he hadn't slept since. He hurried toward us carrying a bouquet of flowers from the hospital gift shop. Maya, please, I just want to talk. Before he could come any closer, my father stepped forward. Almost at the same moment, one of the hospital security officers calmly moved between us. You need to remain where you are, sir. Ethan looked past them, his eyes fixed on Leo. I just want to see my son. My mother tightened her arm around my shoulder. I didn't move. A second later, Denise hurried forward, clutching a stuffed teddy bear still wrapped in store packaging. She held it out toward me. We bought this for the baby, her voice trembled. Let's not throw away a family over one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding, I almost laughed. A misunderstanding was forgetting an anniversary, or buying the wrong brand of cereal. Leaving your wife in labor because your vacation mattered more wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. Gerald folded his arms across his chest. You're humiliating everyone. You've made Ethan look like a monster. I looked at him calmly. I didn't. He did. For the first time since this nightmare began, I noticed none of them asked how I had survived labor. None of them asked whether Leo was healthy. Everything still revolved around Ethan. His reputation, his career, his embarrassment. Ethan took another cautious step. Maya, I made a mistake. I know you're angry, but people deserve second chances. I studied his face carefully. Do you know the first thing you asked me after our son was born? He frowned. You asked why your company was calling. You didn't ask if Leo was healthy. You didn't ask whether I was alive. You asked about yourself. His shoulders dropped. I panicked. No, I answered quietly. You revealed your priorities. Silence settled between us. Finally, Brenda stepped forward. She had arrived only minutes earlier but had quietly watched the entire exchange without interrupting. She handed Ethan a sealed envelope. From this point forward, she said evenly, all communication regarding Ms. Wallace, the child, property, custody, or visitation will go through my office. Ethan stared at the envelope. A lawyer? Maya, you're seriously doing this? Brenda didn't wait for me to answer. There will be no more unexpected visits. No repeated phone calls. No contacting her through relatives. No attempts to pressure or intimidate her. If you ignore these instructions, we'll simply add that behavior to the existing documentation. Denise looked offended. Documentation? Brenda nodded once. The security footage, the text messages, the voicemails, the emails, the hospital records, the witness statements. She closed the folder in her hands. Your family has been remarkably generous in creating evidence. No one spoke, because no one could deny it. Every angry message, every voicemail demanding that I fix his reputation, every accusation that I was ruining his career. Each one had become another piece of the truth Ethan kept insisting didn't exist. As my father secured Leo's car seat inside the SUV, Ethan's phone began ringing again. He glanced at the screen. His face immediately lost what little color remained. HR, he whispered. No one said a word. He answered anyway. We couldn't hear the conversation, but we didn't need to. His shoulders slowly slumped. His eyes filled with panic. At one point, he quietly said, I understand. Then, I'm sorry. When the call ended, he simply stood there holding the silent phone. What happened? Denise asked anxiously. He swallowed hard. They've opened a formal investigation. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered standing in the driveway, begging my husband to drive me 20 minutes to the hospital, while he worried about airline tickets and leather seats. Compassion didn't require me to forget reality. I gently kissed Leo's forehead before climbing into my parents' SUV. As we pulled away, I looked through the rear window one last time. Ethan remained standing outside the hospital entrance, not chasing the car, not shouting, just staring at the envelope in one hand and the phone in the other. For the first time since I had met him, there was no one left to blame except himself. The investigation moved much faster than Ethan expected. People often imagine consequences arriving with dramatic courtroom speeches or headline-making lawsuits. In reality, they usually begin with quiet emails, internal meetings, simple questions that suddenly become impossible to answer. Less than a week after I left the hospital, Brenda called with an update. Northline has officially opened an ethics review. I sat on the back porch of the townhouse while Leo slept peacefully in a bassinet beside me. They're looking at everything? They have to. Brenda sounded calm. The issue isn't only the video. It's the difference between Ethan's public image and his documented conduct. Northline had spent years marketing itself as a company built around family values. Television commercials showed fathers teaching children to fish. Magazine ads featured smiling couples gathered around backyard fire pits. Ethan himself had spoken at sales conferences about trust, commitment, and putting families first. Now HR possessed a recording of one of their regional managers refusing to drive his wife to the hospital because airline tickets couldn't be refunded. No communications department in the world could explain that contradiction away. Meanwhile, Ethan continued making the same mistake over and over again. He wouldn't stop talking. Despite Brenda's formal notice requesting that all communication go through her office, new emails kept arriving. Some sounded desperate. Please, Maya, let's handle this privately. Others sounded angry. You're destroying our family over one bad decision. Then came the messages that removed any remaining sympathy I might have felt. If I lose my job, you'll have to explain that to Leo someday. A real wife protects her husband's future. Brenda smiled the first time she read those messages. He's still trying to make you responsible for the consequences of his own choices. She printed every email, saved every voicemail, and documented every attempted call. Sometimes, she told me, people build the strongest case against themselves. A few days later, Russell called. He didn't sound satisfied. He sounded disappointed. I wanted you to know something before you hear it somewhere else. He explained that he had never demanded Ethan be fired. He hadn't organized a boycott. He hadn't contacted the media. He had simply sent Northline's executive team one straightforward question. Is this the standard of leadership your company wants representing your brand? Nothing more, nothing less. The investigation that followed belonged entirely to the company. The truth didn't need exaggeration. It only needed witnesses. Soon afterward, Brenda attended an initial mediation conference with Ethan's attorney. I wasn't required to appear. When she returned, she summarized the meeting in one sentence. He still doesn't understand. What do you mean? His first concern wasn't custody. It wasn't your recovery. It wasn't Leo. It was whether we would agree to release a statement saying the video lacked context. I couldn't help shaking my head. There isn't any context that makes abandoning your wife in labor acceptable. Exactly, Brenda closed the notebook. Which is why I declined. As the weeks passed, the evidence continued growing. HR obtained copies of Ethan's emails. The hospital confirmed my admission time. Phone records established exactly when he called and what he asked about first. Even Denise and Gerald unknowingly helped. Instead of stepping back, they continued sending messages insisting I owed Ethan another chance because marriage means standing beside your husband. Brenda quietly added those messages to the file. They're demonstrating a consistent pattern, she explained. Not accountability, entitlement. Eventually, Northline completed its review. The official letter never mentioned social media. It never mentioned public outrage. Instead, it cited two simple reasons: poor judgment and conduct inconsistent with the company's leadership standards. His promotion disappeared. His annual bonus was canceled. His largest client account was reassigned. Several weeks later, his employment ended altogether. Around the same time, family court finalized temporary custody arrangements. Because Leo was still an infant, and because Ethan's documented behavior raised legitimate concerns about judgment and reliability, the court ordered supervised visitation until he completed parenting education, counseling, and demonstrated consistent responsibility. When Brenda called with the decision, I didn't celebrate. I simply looked across the room where Leo slept peacefully after his afternoon feeding. This had never been about winning. It had always been about making sure the person who depended on me most would never again depend on someone who had proven he couldn't be trusted when it mattered most. A few days later, Ethan requested one final conversation through our attorneys. Brenda advised me that I wasn't obligated to agree. After thinking about it overnight, I accepted. Not because I believed he could repair what he'd broken, but because I wanted absolute clarity before closing that chapter of my life forever. The final conversation happened almost 2 months after Leo was born. By then, our lives looked completely different. I had settled into a quiet routine with my parents. Mornings began with bottles, diapers, and sleepy smiles. Afternoons were filled with pediatrician appointments, short walks through the neighborhood, and learning that healing rarely happened all at once. It arrived in tiny moments: the first full night's sleep, the first time Leo smiled without gas, the first morning I woke up without immediately replaying the driveway in my mind. Divorce papers were moving through the court system. Custody arrangements had already been established. Child support had been calculated. The house we'd shared was being prepared for sale. Legally, our marriage was almost over. Emotionally, it had ended the moment Ethan chose a flight over his family. Brenda arranged the final conversation through a secure video conference. She sat beside me. Ethan appeared on the screen from what looked like his parents' dining room. The difference between us was impossible to miss. I looked tired in the way every new mother looked tired. He looked defeated. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. I've had a lot of time to think. I made mistakes. Mistakes. Not choices, not betrayals. Mistakes. I've lost my job. I know. My parents are struggling. I know. My friends stopped calling. I know. He looked directly into the camera. I've paid enough. The words settled heavily between us. Paid enough. As though consequences came with a receipt. As though abandoning your wife in labor had a price tag that could eventually be considered satisfied. I asked him one simple question. Ethan, if you could go back to that morning, what would you do differently? He answered almost immediately. I would have canceled the trip. I nodded slowly. Why? So none of this would have happened. I felt something inside me quietly break. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't. He never said, I would have stayed because you needed me. He never said, I would have stayed because our son deserved his father. He never said, I would have stayed because I loved you. His answer was still about consequences, not compassion. He wasn't grieving the pain he caused. He was grieving the life he had lost because of it. Brenda looked at me. She knew I'd heard it too. I took a slow breath. Ethan, for weeks, I kept wondering whether I had somehow expected too much. I wondered if I should have been more patient, more understanding, less emotional. I glanced down at Leo sleeping peacefully in my arms. But then I realized something. Our son is going to grow up watching how people treat one another. One day he'll ask me why we aren't together, and when that day comes, I want to be able to tell him the truth, that love isn't measured by promises. It's measured by presence. It's measured by who stays when staying is difficult. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. I love him. I hope that's true, I answered gently. But love has to become behavior, not excuses. He lowered his head. I don't think you'll ever forgive me. I considered the question carefully. Then I answered with complete honesty. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. I don't wake up every morning hoping you suffer. I don't want revenge. I don't even hate you anymore. But I also won't rebuild trust with someone who destroyed it when our family needed him most. He wiped his eyes. So that's it? Yes, that's it. For the first time since our marriage began falling apart, there was nothing left to argue about. No blame, no shouting, no bargaining. Only truth. The divorce became final several weeks later. There wasn't a dramatic courtroom confrontation. No emotional speeches, just signatures, paperwork, and two people legally acknowledging what had already become emotionally undeniable. Later that afternoon, I stood outside my parents' house holding Leo while autumn leaves drifted slowly across the yard. My father was assembling a small wooden swing beneath an old maple tree. My mother laughed from the kitchen window as she watched us, for the first time in a very long while. Home felt peaceful, not because life had become perfect, but because I no longer had to convince myself that neglect was love. A few months later, on Leo's first birthday, we planted a young oak tree together in the front yard. My father dug the hole. My mother carried the watering can. I held Leo as his tiny hand brushed against one of the leaves. This tree will grow with you, I whispered. And every year it gets stronger. Its roots will grow deeper. I smiled. Just like us. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see while I was living through it. Families aren't built by wedding vows. They're built by ordinary choices made during extraordinary moments. When someone is frightened, who stays? When someone is vulnerable, who protects them? When someone needs you most, who shows up? Those answers reveal more about love than 1,000 beautiful promises ever could. If my story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. Never mistake endurance for devotion. You are not asking for too much when you expect kindness, respect, and support from the person who promised to stand beside you. The right people won't see your hardest moments as an inconvenience. They'll see them as the moments that matter most. And sometimes, the family that truly saves your life isn't the one you're born into or the one you marry. It's the people who refuse to leave when everyone else walks away. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone's true character during the moment you needed them most? If you believe love is proven through actions, not just promises, I hope you'll share this story with someone who may need that reminder today. Thank you for spending this journey with me. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the people who choose to stand beside you, and I'll see you in the next story.